Thank you for joining us for another free ASTQB webinar. Today's topic is testing is risky business. You know, we all know there's never enough time or budget to devote to testing, it seems. So the big question is, if you can't do everything, how do you set priorities and focus on what is most important? This webinar will examine the role of risk analysis in various types of testing. It will address specific software product risks for quality such as functionality, performance, reliability, and usability. Our speaker today is Taz Daughtry. He leads the cybersecurity education effort at Central Virginia Community College, where he also teaches programming and networking courses. Taz is a long-standing member of the American Software Testing Qualifications Board, ASTQB. He is also a fellow of the American Society for Quality and the founding editor of the peer-reviewed journal Software Quality Professional. I'm also pleased to re-announce, I guess, since it's recent news, and we did send out a little bit of a note on that Taz is also the ISTQB representative to the working group jointly sponsored by ISO and IEC. So with that, and maybe Taz can give us a little bit more information about all of his many years and many different credentials, but I'd like to turn it over to Taz.
Thank you very much, Dave, and looking forward to sharing some insights. I'll just have to say that one of the great things about these kinds of webinars is that they basically give me a good opportunity to pull some thoughts and ideas together. And for me to share some of that with you, I would appreciate having that opportunity. I also look forward to the idea that you might have some good questions for me. So I am trying to advance my screen. And do I have control, Dave? There we go. All right. The idea of risk-based testing is really the issue that I want to be talking about today, and some of the information insights from the ISTQB, the International Software Testing Qualifications Board, specifically the glossary, which is the basis for much of the work in all of the various certifications. I'm continuing to have problems forwarding my screen. So have we frozen up or done something differently, Dave?
I don't believe so, but go ahead and talk a moment here. Oh,
all right, I got it.
Maybe there's just a little bit of a lag.
All right, got it. Okay, well, basically I want to have a three-part discussion, and I mean discussion in the sense I want to share some things and then see if you have some comments and questions. So we'll take pauses at each of these 3 points. The first issue is going to be what we mean by risk. Risk of surprises. Unfortunately, they're not usually as pleasant a surprise as having a surprise party, but the issue of what we mean by risk and how we can understand risk. Then secondly, I want to talk about how we can identify risk and how we can use risk to set some priorities. So that will involve some investigation and prioritization. And then finally, and I know you'll have to wait and see why the peanut butter on toast winds up being an image, but essentially why we want to use risk and how that will help us in planning our testing strategy. Basically, risk-based testing is a strategy and it supports any technique and any particular type of testing, a particular life cycle you find yourself in. But basically, we're using the idea of risk analysis to help us decide priorities, emphasis, allocation of resources. And that's quite a common place that you always understand that you're up against schedule and budget constraints. That's certainly the issue, particularly with testing, because unless you have a very well-informed and enlightened approach to software development, often testing is not as integrated and as comprehensive and parallel and incorporated with the rest of the development activities. So you could have a very, what I almost call a pathological type of structure in which these are almost an afterthought. And basically that means that when everything else has been allocated budget and schedule, often testing techniques wind up being allocated the remainder. And I know you can imagine feeling in this situation, if you haven't already experienced that, of the walls closing in on you as we are approaching whatever release date or commitment date we had, as the budgets are dwindling, and that basically you're caught under the pressures involved in the classic schedule and budget, but also there are pressures from your management, the pressures from the customers that want to have the released product. And so the real issue here is, do we have a strategic way of dealing with these pressures? And I would just suggest that other than using something like risk-based management, risk-based testing, we could just play whack-a-mole. And so essentially one of the ways in which people find themselves dealing with situations is when something emerges or some problem presents itself, you simply react to that. There are other strategies, which I really wouldn't call strategies, such as the idea of just working as fast as you can until you run out of time or you run out of budget. Setting some sort of priorities, maybe being driven by some of those external pressures, maybe particular concerns about what management or what the customer base has deemed to be important or significant. But it does seem that often you're in some sort of situation where you feel that you really are either juggling many different tasks or fighting many different brush fires. And the real decision is to keep your eye on what's important, what's significant, and not just be rushing from one to the other or doing the whack-a-mole approach. So suggestion is that if we think about risk and a means of testing strategy driven by risk, that would give us some insight so that we're not in such a reactive or just sort of an ad hoc mode. What I'm going to be basing a lot of the discussion on is the material that's available in the ASTQB glossary. This is the collection of those terms that are expected to be understood and how they're to be applied in all the certifications that ASTQB manages. And what I want to just introduce you to are some of the key ones. Let me just show you that what I'm going to be sharing with you is from a website that the ASTQB, American Software Testing Qualifications Board, has provided at their website with the URL as shown. And basically it's a searchable glossary, which as you will see repeatedly at the top, you can enter in the particular term, and as this particular screen shows, it will include a definition. I'm just going to zoom in on definitions as we go through different portions of the presentation. At the bottom of this screen, it shows you other terms that are in the glossary that have that particular root term in it. So there is a distinction, pretty standard distinction between risk to the product or the quality of the product. That's the two types of risk: product risk and quality risk, and risk to the project, the activity of producing the product. That's project risk. If you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, in fact, there are indications of which syllabi they are, these terms will be found in, and the check mark indicates that they are designated as keywords. So basically you have the whole list of all the possible syllabi for all the different certifications, and if this term appears in any of those, it will be listed here, and the ones that are checked are the ones in which it's significant enough that it is a key word. But certainly all of this is very foundational in the sense that it's expected for people to master in the foundation, and then for the other certifications that are based on that. So I just want to navigate a bit through some of the glossary entries to see what they will give us insight about in terms of the area of risk. So this is the a zoom in of the key term itself, risk. And the idea is that we are talking about some factor that could result in future negative consequences. So it is an expectation or a concern or something that has not yet happened. It's in the future, and we typically worry about negative consequences. I don't think most people talk about the risk of winning the lottery, but you can turn this around. I know in some of my other auditing activities, when there is a finding or a deficiency or whatever other term indicates something negative, they often can turn that in to say that's an opportunity or a room for improvement. So in this case, we're primarily trying to avoid things that we don't want to have happen. And that would simply be ways in which the software or the software-based system doesn't behave as we expect it. Now, obviously, the term risk has been used in many different contexts, and it certainly is the key term that you would put in any kind of warning sign or any concern that you might have about whether something is going to be safe or successful. And so we certainly need to be on our alert about things that turn out to be risk. As I said, we don't really talk about the risk of a surprise that is a pleasant surprise. So we're primarily looking at the downside of something that turns out in a way that we would not want it to turn out. But because we're future oriented, we want to explore, we want to not have the thing result in the potential catastrophe. So this is a way, obviously, in testing that we probe and that we examine how something might behave when it gets put into operation, but doing it in a controlled environment. And so the whole idea of different testing environments is that to the extent that they can progress all the way up to a realistic environment similar to the way in which the system will be installed and operated, we still want to be able to behave in a controlled fashion, and obviously we can probe and we can be looking for weaknesses or failures and also monitor them in a way that we can have lessons learned from that. So that's a basic idea. And to put the term in front of testing to say that we're talking about risk-based testing, let's see what the glossary has to say about risk-based testing. It's mentioned in a number of the syllabi. It's an approach. And again, I'll just make the distinction that risk-based testing is a strategy. It's not a technique. It's in support of any technique. It's in support of the idea of how you set up which tests to run, the sequence in which you run them, the priorities you give to them. And the goal here is to reduce the level of risk, product risk, in the sense that the way in which the system will function when it's finally put into operation. We don't want it to have negative consequences. So if the risk is the possibility of there being a negative consequence, then we want to make it less likely. We'll talk about what we mean by risk level and how we measure risk level. But essentially, the motivation for risk-based testing is keeping an eye on what we want to avoid have happen. There are other types of testing which are confirmatory, for example. There are other types of testing strategies which may be a part of the overall approach to testing, in which you're trying to confirm that something does meet certain requirements, satisfies certain obligations, is within regulatory constraints and so forth. But the other side of this is to think from a negative point of view, what could go wrong, what are the risks, and then use those risks to drive, first of all, the attempt to reduce the level of risk, and then furthermore, to inform the stakeholders about the status of risk. So stakeholders, all the people that have an interest in the product and the work that's being done on the product. It includes your development team, could be your sponsors, could be the ultimate customers. All of those are stakeholders, and they deserve to have as explicit a visibility into what is going on. How much risk are we willing to accept? Again, individuals, organizations have different degrees of to which they're risk averse, let's say. And so some people are much more skittish about risk than others. But at the very least, what we need to do is to let people know that there is a particular level of risk. We would hope that as we continue through this work of the testing and obviously the response to the testing results, that risk would be reduced. And one of the things the stakeholders might want to be informed about is whether that level has been reduced to a sufficient acceptable level. And so whatever risk acceptance level that might be in the organization, that would be something we would want to be providing information about. So here's my first opportunity to take a breath. Basically, at this point, I've tried to stretch out what we mean by risk and why risk is a motivation for structuring a strategy that's called risk-based testing. So, Dave, have you been monitoring any questions that anybody might have, or someone wants to poke in with a question right now while I'm taking a breath?
Yeah, so I do have a question or two here. I did want to invite everyone. If you do have any questions, they're in your control panel. You do have an option to submit a question, and we'll answer those either in the breaks here or at the end as may be appropriate. One question that I do have is, the question is, can risk-based testing be combined with other types of testing? Can risk-based testing be combined with other types of testing?
Yes, I really think the idea here is the test techniques are a whole nother level. That's basically your tactics. So strategy versus tactics. Risk-based testing is the motivational framework. It's the way in which you're going to structure things. Then what you do in terms of which techniques you use would be which tools you then employ. So I see it, they're complementary, and that risk-based testing is the first view of how you lay out your strategy. And then depending on which tools and types of techniques you're using, you then deploy those techniques more or less or applied to different areas. But clearly it would be in support of any other type of technique. And really by itself, it doesn't tell you much of anything. It just simply says, here are the places we need to be testing most seriously.
Okay, that's very helpful. We do have a couple of other questions popping up. The next one is, for risk-based testing, do you look beyond probability and impact? So let me restate that, or not restate it, but repeat that. For risk-based testing, do you look beyond probability and impact?
I'm going to get to that actually in the next section, but the idea is that that's a classic way of talking about what we would call risk exposure. And some people very, I won't say simplistically, but very straightforwardly simply say, let's multiply the probability something's going to happen by the consequence. So if I have one chance in a million of winning $10 million, then I can say that my risk, or in that case, my opportunity is $10. That is the most straightforward way to do that. I want to show but that's the usual way that people think about risk. And then there may be some ways that you want to trigger. Maybe I'm more interested in things that are the most likely. Maybe I'm more interested in the things that are most consequential. So it may not always be a straight probability, but that at least is a good first estimation or first approximation at what we mean by calculating risk. And some of it may be very qualitative. And then as I'll show you a little bit, hang on, we'll talk a little about how that might be quantified as well. Anything else at this point?
Yeah, a couple of other questions that are there, and feel free to defer if needed or whatnot. And the next question comes up and it has some acronyms in it, so I'm going to pronounce them, and if I get them wrong, since I'm only play a tester on TV and in webinars apparently. So the question is, what test techniques are recommended by ASTQB out of PRAM, PRISM, or SST? So let me re-say that. What test techniques are recommended by ASTQB out of PRAM, P-R-A-M, PRISM, P-R-I-S-M, or SST?
Yeah, I don't think that we are basically saying there's a recommended technique or approach. We certainly try to be pretty tool and technique agnostic. The ASTQB array of certifications does recognize that many of these can be applied across a wide range of testing approaches. And then when there are certain types of development environments, such as Agile, which has been added to the array of certifications, we'll recognize that. But we're probably better not trying to say that we recommend or deprecate any one of those particular techniques. And I'll be happy to dig into that maybe if we don't have time during this talk offline with anybody. And I'm going to make sure, I think I have at the very end, an email so that basically you can keep in touch with me about that. So anything else real quickly, I'll be ready to move on.
So,
okay.
Yeah, one last question, and again, feel free to defer if we're pushing the time limits, but it's a relatively straight question. I think it's a really good one, though. The question is, can experience help in the testing risk approach? Can experience help in the testing risk approach?
Sure. I'll be about 4 slides down, and I'll get right to that. So I didn't even plant that one, but that's a good segue.
That's perfect.
That's a good segue.
Okay. Well, let's continue with the webinar then.
All right, no problem at all. No, some more elaboration on risk-based testing from within the glossary entry is basically we're looking at product risk, and then based on the level of that product risk, we want to guide the test process. So that's basically the framework I've indicated. The 2 pieces of this that I'll focus on here is what we mean by identification. How identification is done, and that's exactly that last question is a nice component to that. And then secondly, once we have identified the risk, somehow we rank order them. Somehow we talk about risk levels, which is back to that earlier question about quantification. And in whatever means we do that, then the different levels of risk mean that we'll do the testing as driven by, or at least partly guided by that. So let me take those 2 pieces. The first part is, as the definition says, we want to identify the risk. And then secondly, we want to use those risks, particularly when we define them as risk levels, to prioritize. So there are a whole set of techniques in each of these areas. And so we're still laying the foundation for how we go about doing risk analysis. Some of those acronyms that were mentioned and other acronyms that are out there are ways that we can do that. I'm specifically right now been working with the security tester certification, and that's also an area in which I do a lot of teaching and presenting. And there are models, what are called threat models. The difference in security is, and this is why there's an extra issue with security, is that up until we had those concerns, the software just broke on its own. And so we were looking for weaknesses in the software. We were looking at not maybe use cases, but also misuse cases, ways people might misunderstand and use the software in ways we didn't expect. Now we're talking about abuse cases. So we still need to work on identifying where the risks are, but now there are risk actors. So when we're talking about security issues, we're talking about other issues in which the people who are actively trying to break the system or break into the system, then there's another kind of modeling called threat modeling. And those, again, have a whole wonderful range of acronyms like STRIDE and others, in which each of the letters stands for a different step in the identification. But to get to the point that was just raised in the question, there are a number of techniques. These are fairly qualitative techniques, let's say, in which you can be doing risk identification. Clearly, it could be a dynamic, a group dynamic. It could be a brainstorming session. It could be a Delphi technique approach in which people make suggestions and ideas and iterate on that. One of the things that is a very powerful and seemingly very simple but straightforward technique is the use of checklist. There are some amazing ways in which quality has been improved in many other areas. I'm thinking about, for example, the medical environment, in which simply having a checklist basically automates or codifies the best practices, and people simply follow those practices. So a checklist of things that we need to be thinking about, and then that also merges over into failure history. So this is where experience is exactly the issue here. In fact, obviously the things that used to be problems, I think I have that in my very next slide. If there were problems in the past, if there were actual situations that resulted in unacceptable consequences, if the risk actually eventuated, they did happen in the past, then they are risk for today. And what happens as today's risk is we want to keep them from turning into the problems tomorrow. So the backward-looking approach is exactly that, which is we've learned from experience. We know that when we do X, Y, or Z, or the next time we try to work in this environment, or when we've tried to upgrade this way, or when we've had this kind of time pressure, or when we've tried to do whatever other history that we have learned, that experience does guide you. And so I think the history of previous problems, and one of my references is, it's better for somebody else to have the problem and you to be able to know about it than to talk about something that you had a problem yourself. So it's much easier to use the experience of someone else. Let's not let happen to us, which happened to company ABC. I remember that great fiasco back in 2015 when release XYZ failed. But whether it's your problem or someone else's problem, you in fact do learn from experience. So the experience side of this is key to helping you identify risk, which are potential situations. And obviously, if they've already happened, then we know that there is a non-zero probability that they can happen. The second side of this, beyond identification, is prioritization. And so now we have a whole laundry list of techniques, maybe from brainstorming of potential problems or risk. From brainstorming or from previous history, we have a checklist of things we want to make sure don't happen. And so to do some other kind of analytical approach, sometimes a diagrammatic approach is an interesting way to do that. If you're familiar at all with some of the tools of the quality profession, one of them is a Pareto analysis. And so basically a Pareto analysis is a way of stacking up the different entities in a particular list, so a bunch of categories, and how often each of those things happens. This is, I think Pareto's name is also associated with the so-called 80-20 rule. 80% of your problems come from 20% of your sources, or 80% of your business comes from 20% of your customers, whatever. And so basically, the idea of finding out where the few significant issues are and maybe the insignificant larger number. So one way of representing a Pareto chart is with this kind of curve, in which you basically have a series of representations of how many of my problems came from the first 1, 2, 3, 4 categories. And it turns out that pretty quickly you may see that you're seeing the great majority of the issues in a fairly small number of categories. This is just sort of some sort of diagrammatic representation. What occurs to me, though, that might be helpful here is, might this be a kind of metric of what risk you have covered, or what percentage of potential risk you have covered? Now, we haven't done much with we've just identified the risk, but we also need to also think about how significant each risk is. So that's the other piece of this that I'm going to show you next. But just be thinking about how many risks have you covered, or what fraction of the risk have you covered? One of the problems, again, I have with security issues is that people say there's a top 10 or a top 20 list of things to do, or controls to put in place. And I've never really seen a Pareto analysis, never really seen anyone do empirically go back and say, if you fix these 10 things, these top 10 problems, it'll solve 80%, 70%, 10% of your problems. So the expectation is that there might be a significant small number of root causes, a small number of areas. So there might be a few risks that are the real showstoppers, and that therefore you need to be concerned about. So just leave in mind that maybe using some might give you a feeling for how you could, in fact, have a metric, just like we have coverage metrics of other sorts, maybe a risk coverage metric. Let's look at what the risk level is defined at. And notice that originally it could be qualitative, and then it could, in fact, then become quantitative. And as the earlier question asked, at least the standard way, the first order approximation is to focus on what's the consequence, what's the impact, and what's the likelihood, because that's a way of sorting out the risk, because there's some things that have very, very large consequences that may have very, very low likelihood. And it may be that even though those are catastrophic things, they don't happen often enough that they are as important as a risk that we need to be concerned with and address as some less significant consequences that are much more frequently occurring. And I try to use the word likelihood, and as the definition is here, as opposed to frequency, because we're still looking a little bit qualitatively. So let me just give you a couple of pictures here. These are the pictures of the range of consequences. The consequences could be everything from an aggravation, something on that screen that you didn't expect to see, something that causes you to stumble for a while, or there's a little bit of a hiccup, all the way down to being life-threatening. And so clearly on the scale of significance or impact, basically there is in fact a real issue there with what it is that will make it more significant in terms of the consequences. The other piece of that component is how likely is it to happen? And I think maybe this has been a little bit overused in terms of there being the so-called 100-year flood, because they're happening much more and more frequently. But the idea is that there are certain things that happen very infrequently, and that we sort of have that's the most extreme that could happen, but it doesn't happen very often. And then at the bottom we have a count of every day. We're in there every day, and something is happening, or multiple occurrences are happening every day. This can be addressed, as I said, qualitatively or quantitatively, and not to be overly precise, because again, a lot of these are estimates or expectations. A qualitative approach, again, this is sort of from the medical triage environment or whatever, is basically you have a scale. So there's a rank ordering, there's an ordinal scale, and somewhere along the consequence level, the things that need to be addressed right away need your attention right away, and things that are less urgent can take a longer time before we have to deal with them. My favorite 2x2 matrix is to put this out where importance is the vertical axis and urgency is the horizontal axis. So again, a fairly gross level of grouping things in terms of how risky you are, how concerned you are. In that upper right-hand quadrant, you have things that are both important and urgent, or in our case, things that happen frequently and have great consequences. And then you can move down through that scale. Just some simple-minded non-software and non-testing approaches. Upper right-hand quadrant, it's urgent and important, put out that kitchen fire. Now, how you pick between things that are important but not urgent, and urgent but not important? So upper left-hand quadrant, dental hygiene. It's important, but it's not urgent. We don't have to get to that as instantly as putting out the kitchen fire. Lower right-hand quadrant, you've got things like watching a horse race. For all the excitement about any of these Triple Crown horse races, they're over in a couple of minutes. So there's an urgency to it in that you either have to catch it when it's happening if you want to see it live, but it's a little bit further down in the importance level. And the things you really want to avoid in the lower left-hand quadrant are the things that are neither urgent nor important, things that can sit there, and even if they don't get addressed, getting through all your unread emails may be in that particular quadrant. So that's just a commonplace, everyday characterization. We can use the same type of matrix to talk about the quadrants of high likelihood and high impact or consequence. And to bring this to testing, let me just say that in the upper right-hand quadrant, these are really issues that we need to avoid. These are really things that we need to have that we address. And so that may be obviously your highest priority. They're things that have a higher likelihood of occurring, but also have a higher impact or consequence. From a testing point of view, I'm really intrigued by that upper left-hand quadrant, because those are some really significant things. Those could be some real showstopper issues. And yet, because they're low likelihood, if they don't in the normal course of operations happen often, they're also going to be harder for you to find, or you're going to have to be much more diligent and focused in terms of your testing strategy. So things that are in the top half of this diagram are high consequence, high impact, and yet it may be that as you move from the right to the left, from higher to lower likelihood, it's more and more difficult. So you're going to have to work harder to find the test cases that will activate those particular situations. But you may know that that's more important for you to focus on than things that have a lower impact, even if they happen to be more likely. Maybe it's going to be, again, because they're more likely, they're easier for you to design the test cases for as well. So there's one particular takeaway that occurred to me just in thinking through this particular approach, that the low likelihood consequential things that when they do happen would be really significant will be harder for you to find and replicate or to initiate because in the normal operations they don't happen often. So that's really where a challenge is for you to zoom in on your testing. One more point before we take our next break, and that is that when we try to quantify this, one of the weaknesses I see with attempts, and even my own weaknesses, is we try to put a single probability value on what we think is the most likely situation, how often we think this is going to happen. And so essentially we simply say, I have a pretty firm belief that this is the probability, really the probability of the likelihood. I'm pretty sure this will happen once a day, once a week, once every 100 years. And then when the 100-year floods happen twice in 2 years or 3 years, the way we just had happen recently up in Maryland, the 100-year estimation turns out not to be that accurate. And so one of the weaknesses and one of the iterations you have to do to refine risk-based testing is to do your risk analysis to recognize there's probably a distribution, not just a single probability. So back to the question about multiplying out. You're not taking a single probability point value and multiplying it by a single dollar value of consequence, like the 1 chance in a million of winning $10 million. But you're looking at a distribution of values between a worst case, a most likely, and a best case. And when we get more sophisticated, I know there are people out there that are doing this work. They're looking at distributions. This is something like a Rayleigh distribution, and you can sort of play around with the parameters that see what's happening. And what really is the kicker is, as we talk about in a lot of other distributions, there being a long tail, and so there's a very low distribution, a very lightly populated area of the distribution that stretches way out, and it may stretch out to a very consequential situation. So there are a lot of difficulties in changing qualitative to quantitative. In number theory and measurement theory, an ordinal, this is the first, this is the second, this is the third, is pretty easy to do, but twice as significant as number 2 is twice as significant as number 3. You have to be much more sophisticated with your measurement theory than that. But I'll just indicate that there's qualitative that may be as much of a guidance as you want, and to make a harder case to move to quantitative would be your next level of sophistication. So how we get about risk is what we've just been talking about. And Dave, I'm going to take a breath again here and see if any of the things that I've raised issues there before we go into our last section and see if there's some questions.
Yeah, Daz, yeah, this is great. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the control panel. One of the questions is, it probably goes back to your whole quantitative, qualitative discussion, but really, how are the likelihood and consequence estimated? How are the, what would you give in terms of advice for estimating the likelihood and that consequence? Because, the related question is, how do you calculate a risk value? Thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, again, what is the means by which you're identifying the risk? If you're using experience, and if you're using historical data, and the situation can still be projected into the future, that famous disclaimer, past results are not a promise of future, then you have some sort of historical data. I think that 100-year flood example is one in which there's some meteorological data that traces back over some period of time. So in those particular cases, the probabilities might come from some actual data that you have. Usually, much people start is they just try to put some very rough boundaries of very likely, not very likely, possible, very unlikely. And then the trick is to not to be overly precise or accurate by saying, if it's likely, it has one chance in 100 or one chance in 10 or whatever. So it's probably a good first iteration just to try to stay fairly qualitative with that. The consequence side may be a little bit more amenable to analysis and to quantification, because you can say, what's the consequence of this bad thing happening? So if I'm testing a payroll system, and there is a consequence in which, in one of the modes of failure, that people don't get their paychecks, or that we have to do something, we have to fall back on plan B, which has a known additional expense, or we break some regulatory rule, or there's some penalty clause that we can quantify, that if I miss this deadline, it's going to cost me $1 million a day. Then the consequences, and by the way, most people try to, when they quantify their consequences, is to turn it into dollar figures. So everything can be talked about in terms of how many dollars we are at risk. So that sometimes is a little bit more plausible to quantify, but we're still basically trying to say almost, which of the quadrants are you in? And is it more important for you to look at, it's certainly most important if you look at things that's in the upper right quadrant, as I say, but realize that there's some very high consequence issues that may have very low probability, but they would be so damaging if they did happen that you need to apply more resource there than you would need to apply to things that are probably less damaging.
And I think that's very helpful. There's a request, and again, depending on time, or maybe it's a follow-up item. But when you're presenting the whole concept of risk-based testing to your boss or supervisor or the company in terms of wanting to do this, the request is if you could provide some additional good real-life examples of how risk-based testing is used at work, and maybe given the security area that you've been focused on, or maybe just from your own academic experience or past consulting experience. Are there some examples where you've seen, like, here's a very specific real life example?
Great. I was looking for something to do the rest of the week, and so pulling a few case studies like that would be great. And we can do a follow-up, Dave. Let's just say put that in the parking lot of things I'll promise for people as a follow-up. And they don't have to ask me individually. I'm open for people to ask individual questions, but since that would be very helpful to move to the next level, even if I don't do it in the next webinar sometime, a few case studies or some links I'll pull together in the next few days. Good point.
Okay. Yeah.
All right,
that would be great. And we'll be sending out a follow-up email to everyone as well, letting them know when the recording's available and whatnot, so we can maybe include that in there, or we'll just follow up with another email after that.
Yeah, that'll work for me. Okay, let me move into a final category of information here, and the idea is that we want to talk about what we're going to do with all of this. Why would this be helpful? And once again, I'm not advancing, so I don't know why I've got a delay time or not. We're beaming this out, and I guess our moon base.
Yeah.
Our moon
Well,
base.
as you're waiting for that.
Yeah, I'm trying to advance.
To move over.
Yeah. Okay.
Let me just ask you one other question as we're getting that to move over.
All right.
If there are issues that are not important, like a spelling mistake, it's not really that important, but it causes your customer to doubt the overall quality. Is that an issue that, how do you deal with that? Is that?
Well, again, it's a matter of what the consequence is. So the consequence may be it's a spelling error, but you may be it may be disconcerting for someone to see spelling errors sneak into that. I mean, someone used the example of, do I worry about whether the airplane has been properly maintained if the fold-down tray of mine is dirty? Well, I'm hoping they're giving more attention to your engine than to the fold-down tray, but it may begin to create an issue of thoroughness. And so I think it would be a matter of what the setting is. If people are unforgiving about attention to detail at that level, it begins to make people worry, at least, about the other, whether or not the spelling, the mistake in the spelling, as long as you don't misspell something in your programming language. I moved ahead here, so let me try while it's working. Let me talk about another glossary term. Is risk type. And basically the idea here is that we want to group our types of risk, and that would give us some particular insight. So the key phrase in here is there's some common factors that tell us something about different types of risk. And so we may have a laundry, I don't have no idea, you may have 100 risk, but if 100 risk, and that's where if you clump them together, particularly if you're doing a Pareto analysis, say these 5 have something in common, these 8 have something in common. Then another very helpful technique in the quality discipline is sometimes called the fishbone diagram, as you might recognize from the image, or the Ishikawa diagram. But basically, it's a way of analyzing the various contributing factors, and it's also a way of pulling this together. This example is just a software-specific one, but not a testing-specific one. Talking about inspection techniques, but the idea is there is some categorization and some grouping. And so one of the things that the risk grouping and the risk type gives you some insight into is how that then correlates to what type of test you need to do. So now we're going to get into, say, how does the strategy of risk-based testing drive the techniques and the strategic down to the tactical level of which particular types of tests you run. You have an array of types of tests to run. So, for example, from the glossary, it specifically says that you relate the types of risk to the types of testing. And if the types of testing give you insight to allow you to reduce that particular kind of risk, then that's the test that you need to match up. So to give a concrete example here, when it talks about types of testing, and this is a continuation just from the glossary, it says, for example, if there is a risk in dealing with user components, usability, then clearly the addressing area of technique would be usability testing. So essentially, it's relating those two things. If you look at the risk and you see, well, I got 100 risks, but 17 of them all happen to be variations of this particular thing. Like they all are aspects of ways that user interactions may be inappropriate. Then drive that over to the type of testing you should do. So techniques can be driven by a risk analysis that involves typing. And that gets me to the peanut butter on toast, because not only are we talking about the types of testing, but how much testing and where you distribute your testing effort. And so basically, you can't spread the peanut butter across the whole piece of toast. If you don't have much peanut butter, you don't have much time, you don't have much resource, you don't have much budget, you basically are going to have to adjust when and where you put that. Otherwise, you're spread so thin, you're really not doing much of anything. So again, back to the glossary discussion of risk level. The risk level helps you understand the intensity of the testing that needs to be done. So it's basically how thick you need to spread that particular peanut butter on those pieces of the toast. That's horrible mixed metaphor example sort of thing here, but the idea now is that once we understand that there's a high risk level, then that level needs more testing than the others. So to put it all together, and this is a sort of a final collection of a picture here, is that rather than playing whack-a-mole, we'll target which of those places need the most attention. So where are the higher target areas? Where are the higher risk areas? So targeting is one of the benefits of risk-based testing. It tells you which aspects of that system and of the testing of that system need to be targeted. So that partly is an issue of where you target. Then what are the tools you're going to use? You got a toolkit. So you got usability testing, and you got performance testing, and you've got a variety of other ways you're checking to see, is the system secure? Is the system efficient? Is the system able to handle X, Y, and Z? And so each tool is a tool that is more suited in a testing technique for a particular type of risk. And so that is another insight that you gain once you do some typing and you do some grouping, some risk analysis that basically tells you something to the extent of which of those types of risk are most significant. Then we can find which tools, and then how much do we need to use each tool? So how much resource needs to be applied in each area? And once again, if we have even a semi-quantitative approach in which we're talking about risking a risk exposure, then that risk exposure needs to be addressed in proportion. The testing effort needs to be proportional. So if it's a high risk thing, whether it's a high probability or a low probability of a very high consequence, then that's how much resource we need to apply. So that brings us full circle to talking about the why as well. I have just a couple of slides I'd like to do, and then I will be willing to take any other accumulated questions in the remaining few minutes. But I just want to touch on a couple of points of how this fits into the bigger issue of risk management, if I may. Basically, as we talked about the two sides of the calculation of risk, in risk management, broadly speaking, we talk about avoiding risk and mitigating risk. If we use those words carefully, avoiding a risk means making it less likely the risk will occur. So that's really what your testing is doing. Your testing is trying to detect things that need to be addressed so that the risk doesn't eventuate, doesn't become the problem. Somewhat beyond the range of a lot of the risk-based testing is other actions about consequences being reduced. That's the mitigation issue. And that may be driven by insights that you have, because you're never going to reduce your risk probability to zero. So once again, risk exposure, this is I invested a lot in that animation there. Risk exposure goes down when you're avoiding a risk because you've got a lower probability. The testing helps you find the areas that need to be fixed so that it's less likely the thing happens. The other piece of this, risk mitigation, is a way of reducing exposure by reducing the consequence. And that really is beyond the testing, up to the point that you simply say, I can't guarantee there's a non-zero chance of this thing happening. What do you have as your backup plan? How do you switch over? What's your fail safe? What are the other areas that you might address? So that is a part of the broader issue. And then the final point I would make is, in talking about risk reduction, what is your return on investment? Return on investment, numerator on denominator. In risk exposure, if the return, if we make it less likely the risk happens, then the amount of return we get is proportional in the ROI calculation to how much investment we made. And so again, risk-based testing is a technique of investing in certain types of risk management to maximize the amount of risk exposure reduction. Make the numerator as large as possible compared to the denominator. Then every time we get squeezed, we can find some way to break through and basically focus most on our high risk areas. That was what I want to share. I've been red carded on the time, but I think we still have a few minutes. So Dave, any other questions that I can address in the time that we have left?
Yeah, well, yes. So we have a good question here in that you just talked about the consequences and that ROI. Mm-hmm. should you, I guess the answer is probably no, but maybe it's not. I mean, should you always focus on the risk with the highest consequence?
Well,
you always focus on the risk with the, right?
No, you focus on the risk with the highest exposure, because there may be a consequence that's not that high, but it happens so often that the multiplicative factor, in other words, if you got 1 chance in 10 of having $1 million problem, and only 1 chance in 1,000 of having $100 million problem. I mean, crudely speaking, the most consequential thing is not necessarily the one that has the greatest risk exposure. This is basically where I guess it's a starting point of a discussion, because all of these things are pretty much judgment, and because they begin at least semi-quantitatively, if even that. Basically, one of the things you have to think about is the high consequence things may have very low probability. That's that upper left-hand quadrant. It may be that those things are very, very difficult to expose in your testing, because they're very, very unlikely to happen in reality. You have to understand very carefully, and maybe there's a whole set of consequences that happen, or you maybe even can't replicate that whole sequence. This is where, if it's historically based, you can figure out, well, why did that happen last time? That'll give you some idea of how to get yourself in a position to replicate that in a testing environment. But I think it's at least a starting point of a discussion. But it could be that the highest consequence, because it has such a low probability, doesn't deserve as much attention. And because it's going to be very difficult to find it, your return on investment, because you're never going to get to 0 probability. Maybe you're willing to spend less time hunting down that very, very low probability but very consequential result, because that would kill you when it happened. But on the other hand, you'd be dying the death of 1,000 cuts with some less consequential things that are happening much more frequently. So there certainly is a trade-off, I think, there. And again, it'd be a matter of what your risk tolerance is and which categories fall into. Can you quantify them, or is it just we would be embarrassed, mortified, out of business if this particular thing happened?
Right. Good point. All right. So here's a quick question. I think is everything that you went over in this webinar, is everything you went over something that I would normally want to include under the risk section of my test plan? So is everything you went over something I would normally want to include under the risk section of my test plan?
Yeah, I think with the connection that would then drive your selection of risk techniques and your allocation of resources and schedule. So basically, it is the foundation for then choosing which techniques to apply, when to apply them, how intensely to apply them. But it is the springboard that then drives what you then do. Again, it's the strategic approach that then comes down to the tactical approach of, now that we know this about risk, what are we going to do? Which types of tests will we run? Which order we would run them in? How much time will we run them? How much resource will we apply to them?
Okay, that's great. That's great.
And I do appreciate, and I've taken the action item to give some case studies of examples of how that has been done. And typically, there might be some things in the literature I just can't lay my hands on immediately, but I will certainly, when we share some information about the recording being available, I'll certainly be able to provide some links to that, and maybe we'll have some ongoing discussions. Maybe I'll wind up generating another a white paper or a guide or another webinar on this. But it's been good for me to start thinking about this in ways, and these are some good questions that push me in other directions. So I'll keep pushing on that. Anything else?
Great. Yeah. No, that's it for today. I would just say that when you do send over the links to the white paper or those resources, we'll go ahead and include those not only in the email announcement when that goes out, but just going forward, they will be available. We'll go ahead and place them on the page that has the video recording as well, so that people can find them there in case you go back a year from now and you're wanting to access that information. So Taz, wonderful job as always. We appreciate all of your volunteer efforts with ASTQB and your service to the testing community in general. And we look forward to having you join us again, and we look forward to having everyone tune in again and And we hope you also take advantage of all of the previous recorded webinars. You can find everything at ASTQB.org. And if you haven't seen it, one of our favorite, most popular pages is the testing skills and career path graphic you can find on the website. So if you're looking for ways to develop your skills, to increase your value in your organization, and look for those opportunities for promotion, there are a number of software testing certifications that are specifically designed to improve your skills and help you be better testers, as well as professionals who test even just a little bit. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Taz, once again. And with this, we will conclude today's webinar.
Thank you, Dave.